Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the world since 1945. A few of the things that happened were Cold War conflicts, contemporary war conflicts, religious and ethnic conflicts, and there was terrorism, and there was a war in Iraq and a war in Afghanistan. The Cold War complex began in the 1950s and ended in the 1990s. There was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, China, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the essential question for this PowerPoint is, how has the fear of communism determined foreign policy in the 20th century? Analyze this picture, please. It is the President of the U.S., JFK, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sitting on hydrogen bombs, arm wrestling. And Cuba, the problem in Cuba began in the 1950s. It had an unpopular dictator, Vestilla, and he was overthrown by revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro. Castro became the dictator of Cuba. He suspended elections, jailed and executed his opponents, he censored the press, and he nationalized the economy, and he took over the U.S.'s businesses. The U.S. no longer supported Cuba, and they turned to the Soviets for aid. The Bay of Pigs was in the 1960s. The CIA backed and trained anti-Castro Cuban exiles for an invasion of Cuba. The exiles landed on the Bay of Pigs, hence giving it its name. The U.S. refused to back them up with planes, and the result, the forces were defeated, and it was humiliation for the U.S. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviets began building missile sites in Cuba. The U.S. spy planes discovered the sites, and they demanded the removal of the missiles because they were too close to the U.S.'s mainland, and they began to have a blockade of Cuba. The U.S. and the Soviet were at a standoff, and they were on the brink of a nuclear war, hence bringing us back to the picture. And the Soviet agreed to remove the missiles in return for the U.S. to promise not to invade Cuba. North Korea and South Korea split during this time, and it was split up into the northern part that surrendered to the USSR and the southern part to the U.S. The north was mostly industrial, and the south was mostly rural. The events of the Korean War were June 25, 1950, North Korea attacked and invaded South after the U.S.'s withdrawal. This was a test of the policy of containment. South Korea asked the United Nations for help, and China joined the war because they were threatened by the U.S. In 1952, the UN recaptured Seoul, which is in South Korea right here, and they regained South Korea. In July of 1953, the armistice/ceasefire was signed, and the border was established at the 38th parallel, which you can see is right here. President Truman wanted to use the nuclear bomb on Korea. There were communists in North, there were collective farms, industrial, strong military, nuclear weapons, struggle with shortage of food and energy. South Korea, with aid from other countries, developed industries and foreign trade and established free elections and a democratic constitution. North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Their war was the Vietnam War, of course, and their region was under control of France, and their ally was the U.S. Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam defeated and were forced to surrender. Vietnam was divided at the 17th latitude. Northern was communist, southern was U.S. and France established an anti-communist government. South Vietnam was ruled by an unpopular dictator, Viet Cong, an opposed dictator because corrupt began to gain strength, and the dictator was assassinated. The U.S. declared war. The northern Vietnamese patrol boats attacked U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. You can see the Gulf of Tonkin is right here. The difficulties that the U.S. faced was, one, they had to fight a guerrilla warfare in unfamiliar jungles, which means they weren't really familiar with their surroundings, and the Vietnam had the kind of gain control because they knew where everything was and what was happening. Number two, the South Vietnam government was unpopular, and a war at home became unpopular, and there were withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. They had the lack of support from the citizens, and after the U.S. withdrawal, North invaded the South, and millions became refugees. The end of the Cold War was after World War II. The U.S. and the USSR raced to see who could dominate the world politically and economically. In the 1990s, the USSR spends its resources, their arms race and the space race was Sputnik. The USSR collapsed and the end of communists in the USSR. The US emerged as world superpower. Here is a picture, and in case you guys kind of were that went in a blur, I have a video just summing everything up. Thanks for watching this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Bye!